Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's ICIT virtual briefing, Securing America's Infrastructure from Foreign-Controlled Sensor Technology. I'm Val Cofield, the new Executive Director at ICIT, and I'm truly excited to be here. For those new to ICIT, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank solely dedicated to modernizing, securing, and making resilient the systems that provide for people's foundational needs. Today's briefing continues that mission. We're turning our attention to one of the most urgent and underappreciated challenges in national resilience, the embedded risks of foreign-controlled technologies, specifically LiDAR, light detection and ranging systems, that increasingly underpin transportation, logistics, defense mobility, and smart infrastructure across the country. We are honored to be joined by Congressman Dusty Johnson, whose leadership on this issue has been both principled and practical. His Securing Infrastructure from Adversaries Act highlights how transparency in procurement and trusted supply chains are essential to national security. Congressman Johnson has been clear: infrastructure is national security terrain, and trust, control, and alignment must guide every decision about the technologies we embed in our critical systems. We are also joined by Sean Papso, Chief Operating Officer of Invictus, a member of our ICIT Industry Council. We want to extend a sincere thank you to Invictus and our Industry Council, not only for supporting and sponsoring today's event, but for their continued partnership and leadership in advancing resilient and secure infrastructure. We're so grateful for their support and collaboration. Together, this conversation will explore how Congress and the private sector can collaborate to secure the systems that connect and protect us, and how LiDAR serves as a powerful case study for both the promise and the peril of emerging technologies. At ICIT, we often say that trust determines control and control determines resilience. As infrastructure becomes more intelligent and interconnected, every sensor, every supplier, and every contract becomes a national security choice. Today's discussion will help us think through how to make those choices wisely, balancing innovation with protection and openness with alignment. Thank you again for being here, and thank you to our community and sponsors for making this conversation possible. With that, let's get started. Congressman Johnson, I have been working in the national security space for my entire career. Most recently, I was the Chief Strategy Officer at CISA. When we think about critical infrastructure, we don't usually think of it as a battleground for conflicts with nation-state actors. But the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, has been caught pre-positioning itself for both disruptive and destructive cyber attacks in our nation's critical infrastructure. CISA, FBI, and NSA have released several joint advisories alerting critical infrastructure operators, highlighting this issue. And for those of you in the audience that haven't heard of Volt Typhoon, I encourage you to do some research after this event. Volt Typhoon, a PRC state-sponsored cyber group, has compromised the IT environment of the communications, energy, water, and transportation sectors in the US and its territories. Given the legislation that you introduced in Congress, Securing Infrastructure from Adversaries Acts, you are acutely aware of the tactics countries like the PRC are employing to hold at risk our nation's critical infrastructure. What first drew your attention to this issue? And for those that are less familiar with your legislation, what were you trying to accomplish with it?
Yeah, the legislation is pretty straightforward. It just says that the Department of Transportation cannot secure LiDAR technology from problematic entities, number one. Number two, that it cannot contract with entities that are using LiDAR technology from problematic manufacturers. And then number three, it can't give grants or loans to people who are using LiDAR from a problematic entity. So it's pretty straightforward. Some of you may say, well, why just focused on DOT? That's one of the committees I'm on. If you've got a narrowly tailored bill, one committee can hear it. If you've got a bill that's too broad, say every agency has to play by this set of rules, it would have to go through 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 committees, and it would frankly never happen. If you've got a rifle shot like this, it does have an opportunity to make it through the Congress and on a bipartisan basis. As far as what drew my attention to this topic, I'm on the select committee on the Chinese Communist Party. We've done yeoman's work in the last 3 years of really understanding what is China up to. And you're right, you use the term pre-positioning, and that's been a big strategic shift. So much of the cyber activity on China's part for the last 20 years was really focused on espionage, business, commercial espionage, IP theft. They are pre-positioning to disrupt key infrastructure systems if they got to a point where we were in some sort of a flashpoint with China, think Taiwan, or a trade war that continued to escalate. And I can talk more about it, and I know you've got other questions, but at some point we should talk about the war games that those of us on the China committee had, and what, as the hours turn into days, if China invades Taiwan, what does happen to the American infrastructure, because we are nowhere near as hardened as we should be. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you. Sean, I want to turn it over to you. So from your perspective, when you give advice to companies on how to secure their systems, and you see a threat like this, and you see a technology like LiDAR, how do you advise them? How do you help them mitigate against this?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Val. And thank you, Congressman Johnson, for everything you're doing in your committees as well. I think the biggest thing to understand now is that sensors, they're no longer passive. Sensors are embedded. They're powering everything from smart ports, highway logistics, all the way to defense surveillance, battlefield awareness. So when foreign adversaries control the firmware, the updates, or the encryption keys behind the sensors, they're effectively controlling everything we can see, detect, or defend. And I think that's the number one thing that industry needs to understand, especially when looking at their supply chain. China's even taking it a step further. If you've been looking during the last couple of weeks, the Ministry of Commerce is expanding its export control regime. They're including critical minerals, batteries, advanced technologies. They're trying to take a deliberate strategy of vertically integrating power across the supply chain, from extraction of the rare earths to the microelectronics and sensors, which is deepening our national vulnerability profile as a country. So when I talk to industry and when I talk to different companies, understanding your supply chain from start to finish is critical in this respect.
I appreciate that. And then, Congressman, going back to the war games that you talked about, is that what focused your attention on LiDAR specifically? Because obviously there's vast amounts of different parts of infrastructure that we need to be concerned about with Chinese influence. So I was just curious, like what drew you to LiDAR in particular?
Yeah, it wasn't the war games specifically, although I will touch a bit on that here in just a minute. I think it was a broadening understanding on my part about the extent to which the Chinese Communist Party uses information and technology as a major front in this tension. I think a lot of us understand the economic tension between the two countries. I think a lot of us understand the military threat that exists, but frankly, most Americans are wholly unaware of the fact that this information, this control of data, is a key tool in the CCP arsenal. And so I've introduced lots of legislation that just tries to make sure that we're on a more level playing field. And as Sean said, that we have a greater awareness of the national vulnerabilities that exist. In America, we're pretty accustomed to we believe that the data is the data. Like if somebody says that unemployment is 3.1% in this country, that we can generally take that to the bank. And that is simply not how data is managed or utilized with the CCP. And in the war games, we are able to see that within a very few hours, and in some cases before the invasion of Taiwan, American cellular networks start to come down, the American grid starts to come down, our ports are hobbled because 90% of the cranes run on software that is managed, designed within China. And absolutely, LiDAR is a key piece of this. And many of you on this webinar understand how incredibly powerful LiDAR is. And that means that its implementation is far broader than most Americans realize. And if all of this is controlled, or much of this is controlled by CCP affiliated actors, then one button can mean that all kinds of American things no longer work. That would be very bad news during a kinetic confrontation or otherwise with China.
Yes, and when you think about that, and you think about a confrontation like that, so Sean, I know you're aware of these implications and the threats, right? And that the government has been concerned and been trying to prepare in case there is some sort of conflict with Taiwan. What are you talking to, and what are you hearing from private sector? Do they understand this concern and the threat that we're facing?
I would say yes and no. So what is interesting is in the age of, especially when in the age of DOGE, where the government is looking to engage original equipment manufacturers directly, OEMs, there are blind spots in their supply chains, and they recognize this. Sometimes they don't. This supply chain opacity, it isn't an accident. It's a strategic weapon. So we see shell companies, foreign intermediaries, opaque IP ownership. They're creating blind spots in our supply chain. So one of the things that we talk about with industry is we're big proponents of things like trusted platform module training, aspects that take your supply chain a step further to verify that your components and the pieces and parts that are in whatever that hardware or whatever that asset is are actually traceable back to where they came from, and that they're actually coming from where they say they come from. It's very interesting because especially in the US infrastructure, whether it be civil, military, intelligence, we see a series of kind of aging hardware that the support for that hardware has been divested offshore long ago. And to get that support, you're almost reliant on third-party parts, or you have to engage these foreign countries, and then you don't know what you don't know. So to me, it's very interesting when we talk with industry, trying to find that traceability, that is still a blind spot for us. So we don't have full traceability in most cases.
And is there a way, do you think, Congressman Johnson, that we can help with this problem that the private sector has from a congressional point of view? Like, how do we get through that opacity that Sean's talking about and make it more transparent for companies?
Yeah, it is a pretty substantial use of federal power to demand that the private sector do something, right? So obviously in our country, built on freedom, we are pretty loath to do that. Now, we got pretty close to that with Huawei and these telecommunications networks, where we just made it clear that there was going to be a fundamental change from a rip and replace perspective. It's amazing to me that we're making that same mistake in LiDAR, right? We let Huawei get so implemented into everything we were doing on the telecom side, and we are on that path from a LiDAR perspective. And so what can we do? Certainly, bills like mine that bind the federal government will help to send market signals to American manufacturers, and not just American manufacturers, anybody who's outside of an authoritarian, tyrannical regime, right? I mean, I don't mind it if Canada gets good at this stuff too, right? Let's just have responsible players be successful in this space. So bills like mine can help. Information like Sean is talking about, so that the private sector can voluntarily do what they need to do to understand these weaknesses, and how with some strategic decisions with their supply chains, they can reduce that vulnerability. That's really important. Number three, sharing information with state, local, and federal agencies so that when they are giving out money, they can condition or preference putting out dollars to places that are trying to de-risk from this key LiDAR vulnerability. Those are a few things that I think, none of which are terribly difficult, that if we can move in the right direction, we're going to be in a much better situation.
You mentioned Canada and our other allies. Do you feel like that? How do you think we need to engage them, or are there better ways to make sure, or are they aware of this threat and it's just more a game of economics? Or do you feel like we do have some strong allies who are trying to work with us to make sure that they're aware of the risks of using this software, this type of software?
So two things. I mean, first off, one of the great American advantages compared to Russia or China is that we've got great allies that we can count on. I mean, it is this basket of interlacing coalitions and treaties and partnerships is one of the great American strengths. Now, admittedly, we've got more of a populist movement in both political parties that I think places less value on that than I do, but still it's a strength. Even if it's a strength that has been a little undermined in the last few years, it's still a strength. So I think a lot of them are aware, but I don't want to sugarcoat it either. America understands to a greater degree than any other developed country how real a threat the Chinese Communist Party is, and how much reliance on their business partners can be a problem. And it's not just here. And it's not just Huawei. I mean, I can give you a dozen examples that we have analyzed in the Select Committee on China. And in general, a lot of our allies still try to have it both ways. They, of course, want to have a strong relationship with America, but they're hedging their bets a little bit. And they love the benefits of economic activity that comes with doing business with China. And so they're a little bit slower to de-risk than would be ideal. There's some work for us to do. And I would just close by noting that the more trustworthy a partner America is, the easier it makes it for our partners to decide that they can dance with us rather than split time dancing with us in China.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sean, what about your perspective with your clients that are not US based?
So I'm so glad Congressman Johnson brought up kind of that dual use case of doing business with China. When you look at some of these export restrictions that China keeps rolling out, one of them now includes technical knowledge transfer. That's like the know-how behind the system. So you think about LiDAR, China can withhold calibration algorithms, they can withhold advanced sensor packaging, they can even revoke it from international powers there, and they're going to use this as a leverage tool for some of these countries. So it's something we just have to keep aware of, and that deepens the importance of us locking down hardware integrity, intellectual supply chains as we move forward, because we are seeing that. China will use leverage wherever possible with our allies as they do business with them, as they're reliant on some of these Chinese systems. And we just have to be aware of that. Asking them to do too much too soon, I don't know if they'd be ready to do that. And that's just something to keep aware of.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Congressman Johnson, as I mentioned, I've been in this national security space for a while, and I feel like this conversation and the seriousness, right, that we need to take of the Chinese threat, especially with this change in tactics, as you mentioned, moving from doing more counter-espionage stuff to really, like, we have seen in so many examples of our critical infrastructure where they have pre-positioned themselves for possible disruptive or destructive attacks. How do you present this to your constituencies so that they are aware and concerned? Because sometimes I feel like it gets lost in this, DC Beltway kind of discussion. But how do we make that argument to your average constituent in South Dakota?
It is difficult, and of course, we're in a highly polarized political environment, and people like to speak in sound bites and bumper sticker slogans. And international affairs are never really a good fit for that quick hit mentality. And so, I mean, there's some nuance here, right? I mean, the Chinese people are not our enemy. I mean, the Chinese people are the primary victims of the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party. And we're never going to I shouldn't say never, but I mean, frankly, the cost of a complete decoupling from China, that probably doesn't make sense. So it's about strategically de-risking, and it's about building the kind of domestic and friend-shored capacity and capability that we need, particularly in critical infrastructure. I don't mind it if we're buying T-shirts from China, and I certainly don't mind it if we're selling soybeans to them. I mean, both halves of that transaction, at least theoretically, make America stronger. And so, Val, it is difficult to have the conversation, but webinars like this help. Repetition helps. Talking on a regular basis helps. And trying to make sure that people on both sides of the aisle avoid the one-dimensional saber rattling that could drive us into a hot war with China or an escalating trade war that would destroy a tremendous amount of value. This needs to be targeted and focused. This is about good strategic decisions.
Got it. Sean, I loved your term, Congressman Johnson, strategic de-risking. How do you get your companies to strategically de-risk when, a lot of times it's about the bottom line, right? And these products are cheaper. How do you make that argument?
So it's interesting, and I'm glad Congressman Johnson talked about the Chinese people, because this isn't a move towards like xenophobia. We do not need to be in fear of every Chinese person or citizen that we meet. It is a series of bad actors making bad decisions for the CCP. So one of the things that we talk about with our companies is you have what we call kind of a measured risk. Like I said earlier, there are sometimes components within the U.S. infrastructure, wherever it may be, that are reliant on some sort of third party or foreign support to get to where they need to get to from a service level perspective, or just to get the support from a repair perspective. So having that leveraged understanding of risk, I couple that with something, and this might be near and dear to your heart, Val, is CISA 2015, right? Making sure that we're sharing known vulnerabilities, but at the same time, calculated risk, understanding the implications of what it means to get that third party support. So it's, again, it's not a let's be afraid of everyone from China. It's let's take calculated risk and understand what we're actually doing before we just do it because it's cheap.
Well, and here's why Sean is right. I mean, there is a tendency, again, particularly when people speak too one-dimensionally, to this sort of feel like saber rattling and kind of trying to amp up fear, toward a people rather than a particular regime. And so, and I know a lot of your viewers, Val, are going to know this already, but I mean, Hesai, which is really who we're talking about, it's not just them, but this is the real, this is the major market leader. I mean, they filed with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission this statement, which again, well, but I just want to make sure all your viewers understand it. Here's what they disclosed to American authorities. The PRC, People's Republic of China government, has significant authority in regulating our operations and may influence or intervene in our operations at any time. If that's what they're willing to disclose, how much worse might the reality be, right? And so this is not, you don't need to take my word for it. I'm not saber rattling. This is not about xenophobia. This is about clear and documented risks and reliances that we really cannot afford and should work to move in a different direction from.
Yes, I totally agree. You had mentioned earlier in our discussion that there are other things that you are working on to help, mitigate against this risk. And as we get closer to the timeline where we think that there might be some possible tensions or conflict between China and Taiwan, I'm wondering is there anything that you could preview on certain things that you're working on?
Yes, in the same way that we have let LiDAR become an area. Again, most of your viewers are going to know. I mean, North America used to have really a strong first mover advantage in this LiDAR space, and we're the market leaders. So many American companies, we let that erode. That's not just true in LiDAR. It's also true in drones, where we have a substantial problem. And then it's also true in the port infrastructure that I talked about earlier. And it's also true in lots of shipping arenas. There is not a single American-owned carrier. All of the big 6 and 7 are all foreign-owned, including a number that are partners with the CCP. And so these are areas where, as Sean mentioned, I mean, you're not going to get these solutions overnight, but how do you identify your risk, determine what's acceptable, and then make smart decisions to try to aim toward the target? Those would be a few areas, Val, where we need to move in those directions as well.
And Sean, I know that you are aware, of the risks and sort of the timeline that we might be facing when it comes to a possible conflict and how much of our critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. Do you feel like there is a understanding from them of this and how vulnerable we can be here in the States?
I believe they understand it. I think what the holdback currently is they're looking from a shareholder perspective and profit margin perspective, and how much is it going to cost to, say, get every known Chinese component out of the telecommunication system, or get every Chinese component out of the power grid. I think they know, for the most part, where these things are. It really then becomes a matter of dollars and cents. Is the risk worth the investment to get it out now, or are we really rolling the dice? And I think what's even more interesting, and Congressman Johnson, I believe you're a big proponent of this, is China's not stopping with just getting their components in the grid. They're also buying up land. They're buying up farmland in particular, and it is a great opportunity.
Sorry, I was trying to find a video on this exact topic. Go ahead.
Awesome. And they can use shortwave sensor technologies to collect data and ship it back to Beijing. So I think the biggest thing to understand is I believe industry understands the risk. It really just becomes a investment, is it going to make sense? How do I explain this to my boards, my shareholders? How do I explain it to my bottom line? And then why am I doing it now? I hate to have to say that it's going to take something drastic for these people to make moves. I am not an advocate for let's wait for a catastrophe and then let's react to it. But getting them to just proactively move forward has been kind of a struggle. And it's really coming down to that profit margin.
And I think sometimes people don't understand how dire things can get very quickly. So there's a 90-second video on this port technology I'm talking about and how much vulnerability we put into our ports. A lot of American businesses rely on either exporting out of the West Coast or importing from the West Coast. And so I've got the link. I'll share that with Val and her team. And if any of you are interested, it's about the best 90-second mind opener that I think you can have. And there are 1,000 ways in which different critical infrastructures are at risk just like that.
Yeah, that'd be great. And we'd love to share that video with our listeners. So then, Sean, going back, is it, I know one thing that we were working on at CISA is getting boards more aware of this, right? Because you're saying that, we need to convince them and, making them understand how vulnerable we are and that, this is something that's worth their attention and worth their investment and worth maybe, losing a little bit of that profit margin to ensure that we can rely on this infrastructure, if this would happen. Is that something that you think that we need to be doing more of then, is educating and reaching out to board members, helping them understand?
Yes, absolutely. So I think a great kind of third party that's really advocating for this, the National Association of Corporate Directors, they're very much pushing the role of a CIO or a cybersecurity lead for a board to be an expert in the field and to be very much an equal member of any board of directors, whether it be public or private company, for this specific reason. It started out as more of a information security, protecting your own information. But as it's evolved, it's not just protecting your own information, it's understanding your risks as you move forward and what you can do now to prevent those risks from becoming a reality. So I think we should definitely push more into that area.
And I think, Congressman Johnson, I think that you have a very strong pedestal or platform, I should say, to be able to get these kinds of messages out to those boards. Is there something that you're trying to do on a routinized basis to really help corporate America understand? Since, again, as I mentioned before, most of our infrastructure is not owned by the states or government, right? It's owned by the private sector.
Yes, I would say that in the first 2 years of the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, I think we did a good job of telling that story. And we were the shiny new penny. Generally, select committees just come in, they're little tiger teams, they form, they do some good work for a year or two, and then they're disbanded. They're not a permanent committee. And we're no longer the shiny new thing, as we will enter our 4th year here soon. And I think we probably need to find a new energy in telling the story, because if you're not saying something 100 times, it's just not cutting through. And so, no, I think we're probably a little short of where we need to be. It's time to step up the game.
Understood. Sean, so as we are entering the last 15 minutes of our discussion, is there something, Sean, that you want to highlight from your perspective that you want to make sure that this audience is aware of when it comes to not just, you could talk about LiDAR in particular, but also just the general threat as we, again, look to see how much our critical infrastructure is so reliant on Chinese-made software and hardware?
Absolutely. So I often when I leave the Beltway, because Val, you are absolutely right. In the Beltway, we have kind of a very deep understanding of what this looks like. But as you talk to just any American citizen outside the Beltway and trying to explain to them what that means, what I often do is I talk to them like this. I say, hey, how did you get to this meeting this morning? And usually 9 times out of 10, they've used some sort of GPS direction device. And I say, well, what would happen if you just couldn't use that anymore? What happens if that just turns off? Are you going to be able to go anywhere, to do anything, to have your geotagging, your uploads of your social media, your understanding of anything that you're going on to? And I'm like, and let's take it a step further. I also mentioned 2019 Venezuela, when the lights go out. What happens when the lights go out to a country? It goes into chaos, and that would absolutely happen here. We've seen it time and time again in various different crises. You turn the lights off for a week, this country could cripple. It would cripple. And that's just something that I bring to the attention of these folks is, let's understand the challenges here, or, even more common, your Internet of Things like a camera, a nanny cam. We did a study with DARPA that showed some of these third-party nanny cams that you buy from like an Amazon or some sort of worldwide provider. They are emitting a signal and we don't know where that signal's going. And that was just a project we did with DARPA to show the dangers of you're getting recorded without your consent and it's going somewhere. So do you want that? That's the kind of threats that these folks need to understand. And I think when it hits home like that, that's when your typical American says, okay, well, let's take a step back. How do I fix this? So I think that's the important thing to stress there when you're outside DC.
And it's not, I mean, on one hand, we've talked about, okay, China invades Taiwan and then all of a sudden the dials get turned down. But it wouldn't even have to be that, right? I mean, Nancy Pelosi a few years ago became the first sitting U.S. Speaker of the House to go to Taiwan. That irritated China greatly, greatly. They then, over the course of the next few months, did hundreds and hundreds of incursions with military aircraft and seacraft inside Taiwan's jurisdiction to try to disrupt and send the message. What if they had instead decided that they were going to bring down some critical piece of American infrastructure for 24 hours? What if that was going to be the brushback pitch rather than bombers and fighters flying close to Taiwan? It's easy to imagine that. It does not require some unbelievable nightmare scenario. It requires one politician going to Taiwan. And if you are reliant on LiDAR for your business, or if that's in your plans, what would a 24, 48, or 72-hour outage do to you? And your chances of having that outage are much, much higher if you are using a vendor or a manufacturer that is basically controlled by the CCP.
Oh, that makes total sense. As we wind down and end this discussion, are there closing thoughts that you'd like to let the audience know and things that they need to think about?
Sure, I'll kick it off. I would say the biggest thing for me is, as a country, as a nation, we can't afford to treat sensing systems or any sort of Internet of Things type system as a low-cost commodity. We need to think of everything as tier 1 infrastructure that supports our mobility, our logistics, our infrastructure, our national defense. We need to, whenever we look at these components, fund them, secure them, elevate them accordingly. We know China's playbook. They have published a lot. What we don't know, and actually Congressman Johnson may know because he's on the committee, are the things they don't publish, which scare me half to death, because what they have published is scary enough. So we need to know what their intent is. They want to control the inputs. They want to control the knowledge. They want to control the flow. So our response to that needs to be layered, resilient, rooted in a strategic independence that only America can provide through our ingenuity. So I'd hand that over to Congressman Johnson for additional thoughts there.
Rather than talk for 2 minutes, I would just advise every single one of your viewers to figure out a way to hit rewind and listen to the 90 seconds Sean just gave you. Because all of that, those are the central takeaways of the whole, this whole seminar. He is exactly right.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think that this discussion actually got me thinking about other seminars that we should be having. And I think the port issues that you raise, Congressman Johnson, I know that when I was at CISA, I have definitely listened to many briefings that really raised and helped me understand how severe that threat is. And I think it would be great to educate our audience on the issues around port security. But thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate both of you spending this afternoon here with the ICIT community and really helping inform them of the concerns, right, and the real threats that we have when it comes to foreign embedded technologies like LiDAR in our infrastructure. So thank you again. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Bye.